Antietam by Mark Nesbitt. Like many battles in the American Civil War, the one fought on September 17, 1862, has two names. In the North, it was called Antietam, after the landmark creek that winds its way through the scene of the conflict. In the South, it was named Sharpsburg, after a nearby Maryland town. Unlike other battles of the Civil War, however, it is most famous for one thing: the rapidity of its horrific violence. In just 12 hours of fighting, more American blood was spilled than on any other day in the country's military history. 18 general officers were killed or wounded during the battle. Nearly 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or listed as missing after the fighting. The spring and summer of 1862 saw the Confederate military cause in the Eastern Theater on the rise. Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson had run roughshod over the Union armies in the Shenandoah Valley. Confederate troops had driven the Federal forces from the very gates of the southern capital of Richmond during the 7 days battle on the Virginia Peninsula. Under their new commander, Robert E. Lee, the Army of Northern Virginia struck their enemy near the 1861 battlefield of Manassas. Second Manassas, in August of 1862, saw Confederates so determined to win, some soldiers threw rocks when they ran out of ammunition. On a roll, they followed Lee across the Potomac River and into Maryland on their first invasion of the North. Hoping to garner support from the citizens of the border states, Lee kept a tight rein on his men. Maryland's reception of the Confederate Army was nevertheless cool. In order to open a supply route into the Shenandoah Valley, Lee needed to seize Harper's Ferry at the confluence of the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers. One maxim of war is that a commander should never divide his forces in the face of the enemy. More than once, Lee violated that edict during his tenure as commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. On his way northward in early September of 1862, splitting his army and relying on his opponent's caution, he sent Jackson to capture Harper's Ferry. On September 13th, his audacity almost cost him his army. Union Commander Major General George B. McClellan was handed 3 cigars wrapped in a copy of Lee's orders, discovered at an abandoned Confederate campsite, specifying the routes for the divided section of Lee's army. McClellan could now pounce on each with his full force before they could unite and destroy the main army of the rebellion. But instead of acting immediately, McClellan dithered. A Southern sympathizer delivered the news of McClellan's finding Lee's orders to Confederate Cavalry Commander Jeb Stuart, who passed the information on to Lee. In response, Lee plugged the gaps in the South Mountains with Confederate soldiers. Savage and heroic fighting bought Lee a whole day. He was considering retreating to the Shenandoah Valley when word came from Jackson that Harper's Ferry was about to fall. Its capture would net nearly 12,000 Union prisoners, one of the largest wholesale surrenders in the U.S. Army history. Lee sent orders to his units to concentrate at Sharpsburg, Maryland. As it was, McClellan still managed to corner a part of Lee's army near the town behind Antietam Creek with the Potomac River at its back. McClellan's attack began at dawn on September 17th. However, what was to be a coordinated assault struck the rebel line in a piecemeal fashion. Union attacks swept from the north, and fighting rolled southward. For the next 8 hours, Union soldiers fought through areas whose names would be seared into the American military psyche: the cornfield, the West Woods, the East Woods, and the sunken road, soon to be christened Bloody Lane. Lee continued to shift his troops from one endangered segment of his line to the next, barely staving off catastrophe. On the southern end of the battlefield, a handful of Georgia sharpshooters held up Union General Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps from crossing Antietam Creek and encircling Lee's army. When Union assaults drove the Confederates from the sunken road, all McClellan needed to do was to send in his reserves. Confederate artillerist E.P. Alexander saw the imminent disaster. Lee's army was ruined, and the end of the Confederacy was in sight. But true to Lee's estimation of his opponent, McClellan, believing Lee's army was larger than it really was, exercised caution and held back. Burnside's men finally forced a crossing of the bridge that would bear his name forever. Once again, Lee's army was threatened with destruction. Burnside was about to cut off Lee's army's only retreat across the Potomac, but he halted to reorganize his advance. All McClellan needed to do was to send in support to Burnside. Fatally, his caution was once again prevailed. Lee had his own trouble. Looking to the south, he saw a dust cloud rising from the marching troops. If they were Union troops, his army was destroyed. For what seemed like an eternity, an aide peered through the telescope and finally announced the column was marching under Confederate flags. A.P. Hill had arrived after a strenuous march from Harper's Ferry and burst upon Burnside's flank, stopping his attack in its tracks. Dawn of September 18, around the small Maryland hamlet of Sharpsburg, was nothing like the dawn of the previous day. The morning revealed fields that were strewn with some 3,650 silent dead and 17,300 moaning wounded. The two armies sat watching one another, Lee expecting a continuation of the attacks from the previous day, the next of which could be fatal to his army. McClellan seemingly satisfied he had avoided contact with what he fantasized as Lee's never-ending reserves. Lee began his retreat into Virginia. McClellan boasted a great victory, but his main objective of destroying Lee's army went unfulfilled. The Union general assured Washington that Pennsylvania was now safe from Confederate invasion, but within 9 months, the reformed army of Northern Virginia would be crossing the Mason-Dixon line again and marching into the Keystone State. Politically speaking, the Union victory at Antietam did two things. First, it stymied Confederate hopes for earning recognition as an independent nation from Great Britain. Though arms would continue to be sold to the Confederacy bearing the Tower manufacturing stamp and run through the Union blockade, Parliament's interest in full financial and military support would wane after Antietam. Second, though Lincoln was disappointed that McClellan let Lee slip away, it gave him an opportunity to turn the war into something greater. After the victory at Antietam, he could issue the Emancipation Proclamation, making official one of the goals of abolishing in the United States the curse of human bondage. Antietam Ghosts. As a national park, Antietam is patrolled by park rangers. While the staff may not be as large as that as Gettysburg or the Grand Canyon, they are as dedicated a group as you can find. Their job is to protect the resource, meaning the park grounds, the modern facilities, and historic buildings scattered throughout. The Pry House. The Pry House had been a hospital during the Battle of Antietam and was witness to all the horrors encompassed therein. Wounds made by the soft, lead, unjacketed, .58 caliber Minié ball were devastating. If you were struck in the arm or leg, the lead projectile would flatten and shatter the bone into fragments. The only thing surgeons could do, with literally thousands of cases produced in a few hours, was amputate the limb. A Civil War hospital like the Pry House was a non-stop amputation factory. Limbs were tossed out the first-floor windows until they reached the sill, where they were carted away to be buried or burned. When a soldier was struck in the body, incredible damage was done. The soft tissues were known to evacuate from the path of the bullet, so the body would tear itself apart trying to get away from the insult. The bullet would carry pieces of the uniform, which hadn't been cleaned in weeks, into the wounds. Gut wounds with their subsequent peritonitis were nearly always fatal. Worse, the surgeon would dip his hands into the guts of one man, pronounce him incurable, and then wipe a flesh wound of a slightly wounded soldier who would die of blood poisoning 2 weeks later. Antibiotics were virtually unknown at the time of the war, so post-operative infections were rampant. The scene at the Pry House when General Israel Richardson's wife Fanny arrived to care for her wounded husband was no doubt frightening beyond anything she'd ever seen before and utterly overwhelming to the senses. Although the general was considered to be only slightly wounded, infection set in and he took a sudden turn for the worse, and Mrs. Richardson would return to Michigan, escorting her husband's dead body. Another woman who was affected by the horror of the Pry House was Mrs. Pry herself, who saw her lovely dining room turned into a makeshift operating room. The Prys, like so many others in the country where battles took place, were ruined by the war. Apparently both of the women were so affected by their experience of that house that they've returned in spirit long after their lives ended. In spite of careful patrolling by the Rangers, sometime in the mid-1970s the Pry House caught on fire and burned. Fortunately, the brick exterior walls remained, but the interior, both first and second floor, were completely gutted. During the fighting of the fire, something strange was reported by the firemen. According to a story in a local newspaper by Aaron Julius, the Washington County firefighters were there when the fire engulfed the second floor and it collapsed. But because of what they saw at one of the second floor windows, there may have been some discussion among them as to whether they should re-enter the building. A captain was no doubt consulted, and they determined that they saw what was clearly impossible: a woman standing in front of the windows on the non-existent second floor. The story could be dismissed as a figment of the imagination, although apparently several firefighters were witnesses to the impossible scene, and a second set of witnesses emerged about a year later. The Park Service eventually restored the interior of the Pry House, but before they did, 2 rangers on patrol went out to the place one night. As they circled through the parking lot, they noticed something in the gutted building, the figure of a woman standing at the window on the second floor. Apparently there was some discussion as to whether they should check it out for a prowler who apparently could levitate. But they decided that they could probably investigate it just as well tomorrow in the daylight. As the park was restoring the house, a strange thing was seen by the maintenance foreman's wife and 3 or 4 of the contractor's crew. Just after the back stairs were completed, those in the house saw an older woman with long blonde hair come down the stairs, almost as if she had been waiting for them to be completed and pass between the individuals in the crew. She neither spoke nor acknowledged any of them, but they noticed something strange about her. As she passed by them, they realized they could see each other through her translucent form. Though she appeared once again to cause a worker to quit the job, she has since manifested herself in a more common way. Footsteps are occasionally heard going up and down the stairs, unaccompanied by a mortal form to produce the noise. Since the historic renovation of the house, the National Park Service has used it as a medical interpretive center. According to Aaron Julius, the director has heard each door slam shut individually. He went around opening them all, and it happened again, one at a time. The gentle breeze could have blown 1 or 2 on the same side of the house closed, because the wind was only blowing in one direction and not swirling like a tornado. Later, the director's 12-year-old son came down from the second floor and reported that he had seen a woman in 19th century clothing leave one of the offices by going through the wall. There was another story Julius related about a Park Service interpreter who wanted to spend the night in the barn. Reports from the battle indicate that while the house was used for wounded officers, the barn held injured enlisted men. After dark, he was gazing out into a field when he saw a lantern swinging through it. The odd part is that it was moving along where the original road ran from the Pry House. Sharpsburg. The town of Sharpsburg was also filled to overflowing with the dead and dying who have left their psychic impressions of their agony. St. Paul's Episcopal Church in the town was a field hospital during and after the battle. Periodically, nervous neighbors would be awakened by screams coming from the empty church, where similar cries once echoed in earnest as limbs were sawn off and tender torso wounds were probed with cold steel. Some have also seen ghost lights floating in the belfry. A man who started with the National Park Service with me at Gettysburg told an interesting story about the historic house he rented. He was awakened in the middle of the night by footsteps roaming around downstairs. He heard them meandering back and forth and then ascending the stairs to the second floor. He reached into his nightstand and pulled out his little friend, as he called it, his service revolver, and walked in the dark to stand behind the wall next to the doorway leading downstairs. He heard the footsteps coming up the stairs, but remained calm, waiting for the intruder to get close enough. The footsteps were just about to the top of the stairs when he flipped on the light and took the firing position, pointing the gun downstairs at nothing. Bloody Lane. One evening, a group of reenactors decided that they wanted to sleep in the famous sunken road. In spite of the fact that the park is closed after dusk, they managed to sneak their way from their cars across the darkened fields where thousands once lay in their death throes to one of the most blood-soaked battlefields in all of military history. Perhaps they knew something of the crimson-stained history of the site. Along a road carved into the earth by decades of wagon traffic, Confederate soldiers under the command of Daniel Harvey Hill stayed until the last. A famous photo was made of the carnage. Human bodies piled one on top of the other so the bottom of the sunken road could not be discerned, giving it the name Bloody Lane. Confederate General J.B. Gordon's experience was probably typical. Shot in the face, he fell unconscious, face down into his own hat, which rapidly filled up with his blood. He considered himself lucky. A bullet had previously drilled a neat hole in the headpiece, and the gory liquid drained out, saving Gordon from drowning in his own blood. Whether knowledgeable about the awful history of the site or not, the reenactors were about to get a lesson in history they would never forget. One by one, in their uniforms, they lay down on the earth, once drenched with the blood of their ancestors in the very space once filled by the decaying forms of dead men. One by one, they began to leave, muttering about hearing whispers close to their ears, of detecting the moans of the wounded and dying echoing in the shallow depressions, and of feeling a sudden cold chill sweep across them. All left but one, who laughed at them and said he would see them in the morning. The reenactors gathered at their cars and prepared to spend the night there, still uncomfortably close to the fields of death. Within a few minutes, they heard a bone-chilling scream come from the area of Bloody Lane. Across the shadowy battlefield, they saw a form stumbling towards them. It was their comrade who had chosen to remain in the lane alone. He was shaking and utterly incoherent. It took 10 minutes to calm him down. When he did, they heard a story that would chase them as far away from the battlefield as they could get. He said he was lying in the lane, laughing to himself at his cowardly companions. Sure, he had heard the whispering and the moans and felt the chills, but relegated them to his imagination and hardened his determination to stay while the others left. Lying on his back, he suddenly heard a rustling in the grass next to him. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw, between his arm and chest, emerging from the field, a human arm. This was finally too much, but as he started to rise and leave, the disembodied arm and hand turned and pressed down with physical pressure on his chest, pushing him back down into the ground and holding him there. That was when his companions heard him scream, and when the phantom arm and hand released him. Those seeking an explanation for how an ectoplasmic limb could physically hold a person down must look elsewhere. But it has happened before, and may very well happen again, especially when one chooses to counterfeit the dead. The end.